Hello, everyone. Welcome to another lecture promoted by Abralin Vivo, Linguists Online. Today, our guest speaker is Professor Stephen Piantadosi. My name is Guilherme Duarte Garcia. I'm an assistant professor of linguistics in the Department of English at Ball State University. As you know, Abralin Vivo Linguists Online is this initiative, it's a huge initiative of the Brazilian Linguistics Association, Abralin, in cooperation with a lot of other associations and societies. So I'm going to read them here for you. First, the Linguistic Society of America, the Linguistics Association of Great Britain, the Linguistic Society of Europe, the Australian Linguistic Society, the British Association for Applied Linguistics, the Permanent International Committee of Linguists, the International Association of Applied Linguistics, the Latin American Association of Philology and Linguistics, the Argentinian Society of Linguistic Studies, the Spanish Society of Linguistics, and finally, the Brazilian Association of Applied Linguistics. So the event as a whole is designed to give students and researchers free access to state-of-the-art discussions on the most diverse topics related to the study of human language and linguistics in general. So thanks to everyone involved in this great initiative, which is now coming to an end at the end of this week. I'm very, very pleased to introduce our speaker tonight, Professor Stephen Piantadosi. Professor Piantadosi is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at UC Berkeley, where he leads the Computation and Language Lab. He earned his PhD in Brain and Cognitive Sciences from MIT back in 2011, and he has published extensively since then. So his research uses formal computational methods and behavioral experiments to study how people learn language and create conceptual systems. His work has appeared multiple times in journals such as Cognition and Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. He has also been awarded an NSF grant to study the foundational properties of numerical learning in an indigenous Amazonian group. The title of Professor Piantadosi's talk today is One Model for the Learning of Language. Stephen, thanks a lot for being with us tonight. We're really pleased to hear you. And before we get started, let me just remind everyone, I'm sure everyone is already used to this system at this point, but you can use the chat window to post questions throughout the talk. And at the end, we'll have some time to chat and to discuss those questions. So thanks a lot.
Awesome. Thank you. Share here. Cool. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak. This lecture series you have is really fabulous, and I'm really happy to be a part of it. So I'm going to be talking today about a long-running language learning project that's been going on in my lab that's sort of motivated by kind of classic learnability arguments in linguistics. And tries to apply a bunch of kind of modern machine learning tools and statistical inference tools to those learning problems. So today I'm going to start by just giving a kind of very brief overview of some of the classic kinds of learnability arguments that people have put forward in support of universal grammar, UG. I'll talk a bit about a program induction model of human learning, which basically takes data and tries to figure out a good program for explaining the data that it sees. And then I'll talk about results of applying that kind of learning model to 3 different cases. So the first are simple kinds of formal languages that people have argued capture some of the key properties in natural language. Second is some languages from artificial language learning studies, where you can bring people into the lab and study what their acquisition patterns look like. And then the third is just a very simple kind of version of a context-free grammar for English, and we can look at what the learning model does on that. And so after those, I'll have just a couple of slides of kind of general discussion and conclusion, and then I'm happy to answer questions on any part of it. So like I said, the kind of beginning for this are these classic kind of learnability arguments supporting UG that people have made. And the kind of underlying question behind all of them is this big question of how children learn language. What kinds of resources do they bring to learning language? What kinds of processes do they engage in order to figure out, say, the grammar or the semantics that their parents are trying to communicate with them? And there's various aspects of this learning problem that people have argued a lot about. So one of them is domain specificity. How specific to language are the representations and mechanisms that kids bring to language acquisition? And a standard kind of UG answer is something like that domain-specific representations and mechanisms are really needed to explain the specific patterns and structures we see in language. So people make these arguments about, for instance, C command or subjacency or binding theory rules or any of those kinds of things. And they say, look, those kinds of representations aren't used outside of language, right? There's no C command in motor control or C command in vision. And so those are really domain-specific kinds of representations that are really about language. And because of that, those are kind of plausible things that we might think are plausibly innate things, structures and representations that learners might bring to problems of acquisition. A second kind of aspect of children's language learning that people have thought a lot about is the size of the hypothesis space, right? So when a kid begins learning language, how many different grammars effectively do they consider? And a standard kind of UG answer is that, well, it has to be small. And the argument is roughly that it has to be small, meaning a constrained space of possibilities, because the data that kids get is really impoverished, right? So kids only see, kids mostly receive positive evidence. They mostly get observations of parents saying sentences. And whatever positive evidence you get is going to underdetermine grammars, right? So there's infinitely many possible grammars which are consistent with any chunk of evidence that you observe. And so people have used this to argue that the hypothesis space effectively has to be very highly constrained, probably constrained by some kinds of genetic endowment that restricts the space of kind of possible grammars that children are able to learn. And going hand in hand with that is kind of claim about the inferential abilities of learners. So like how sophisticated as learning beings are children. And a standard kind of UG answer is that learners aren't very sophisticated in terms of what inferences they can do. So a lot of people have thought about various versions of say syntactic learning that has to do with parameter setting, and thought about sort of greedy or stochastic ways of setting some small number of parameters to characterize syntax. All of these, I think, kind of go together in terms of trying to make an argument that that children aren't kind of unbiased, neutral learners of language. And one of the kind of key tools that people have used to try to formalize these kinds of arguments has been kind of mathematical analysis of learning problems. Maybe the most famous example of this is from Gold, 1967. Gold basically viewed viewed language acquisition as a problem as a kind of abstract problem of discovering what set of strings was acceptable according to your parents' target grammar. And what Gold showed is that positive evidence is really not enough for learners to identify their parents' target grammar. People who are interested in this, I recommend this Johnson paper, which goes through some of the kind of logic of Gold's argument, as well as some of the critiques of it, of why it may not be a great kind of model for understanding how actual children's language acquisition works. But it's actually worth going through a little bit of how this argument goes, I think, because it helps highlight some of the ways in which it's problematic. So for instance, if we think of a language as just a set of strings, okay, what Gold showed is that even within very simple classes of languages, specifically languages which require only a finite amount of memory, you can find structures that look like this. So L1 is some language here, and L1 is a subset of L2, and L2 is a subset of L3, and L3 is a subset of L4. And Gold showed that there's actually an infinite sequence of even regular languages which look like this, all of which are a subset of some bigger language L infinity. And Gold's argument basically goes that a kind of parent who is giving data to children could conceivably, first give them data to convince them that they're in L1, and then give them data to convince them that they're in L2, and then give them data to convince them that they're in L3, and so on infinitely. And all of those data sets that they provide to the learners are all data sets which are consistent with L infinity. And so that means that if L infinity here was the true kind of target grammar that kids were trying to learn, a parent who was picking data could conceivably mislead them indefinitely, right? You could lead them through some unbounded series of other languages, which are all consistent with the target language, without ever arriving at the target language. You might think, okay, well, maybe maybe you could think of a learner that after L3, for instance, would jump all the way to L infinity. So when you gave them data after L3, they would say, oh, well, L infinity is the right language. And the problem with trying to think of those kinds of learners is that then L4 and all of the other languages aren't learnable under certain assumptions that Gold lays out. So what this basically says is that if parents are, well, this basically provides a worst case analysis, right? That says in the worst case, it could be that parents would, well, that children could receive data and not be able to learn every single possible regular language. And this kind of learning assumption, this kind of learning setup has actually been very influential in people's thought about how language acquisition works. So it's motivated a lot of theorizing. In fact, I just checked, it's averaged a citation every 4 days since 1967, which is a lot of citations. And for kind of a prototypical example of this, you could look at something like Wechsler and Kulikover's formal principles of language acquisition, which takes these kinds of gold-based assumptions, worst case analyses in particular, and applies them to a variety of different syntactic constructions. But as I said, people are not kind of universally happy with this kind of analysis. In particular, one problem with it is that it assumes that parents are kind of actively trying to mislead kids, right? It says that in the worst case, parents could mislead kids through this unbounded sequence of incorrect regular languages. So it's helpful maybe to restate Gold's theorem in a way which brings those assumptions a little bit more to the front. So in truth, this theorem should be stated as infinitely malicious parents who try to mislead the dumbest kind of learners would kind of be able to do so, right? So like it makes very specific assumptions about parents being malicious and kids not being very smart in terms of their learning. And in fact, if you move away from these kinds of worst case Gold style analyses, and in particular start to think about learners who engage in probabilistic inference, then it turns out a lot of these kinds of learning problems go away and can be easily resolved. So this was argued by Horning in the 1960s, but actually I'm going to talk through a more recent paper by Amy Perfors and colleagues, which takes these kinds of ideas of kind of statistical comparison of different grammatical devices and applies them to child-directed speech from Childus. So Perfors and colleagues basically thought of this learning problem as one where what children have to do is some kind of statistical inference about the grammatical system which is generating the data that they see. And in particular, they thought through a simple kind of Bayesian model. Bayesian model is just a way of writing down a kind of coherent probabilistic model. So the basic assumption there is that when learners are thinking through hypotheses, they're doing so in a way which is consistent with the rules of probability. And if you do that, there's two kind of components that you need. There's one component which is a prior, and Perfors et al. Have a prior which basically says that before kids see any data, sort of what's built in as expectations for kids could be some kind of bias for simplicity. So before you see data, you should prefer grammars or grammatical systems which are simple, which means basically they have a kind of concise description. And the second component is a likelihood function, which says for any given grammar, how well does that grammar match the data that you see? You can think of the prior part of this as basically being an implementation of Occam's razor, right? It says, all else being equal, you should prefer grammatical systems which are simple. And the second part is as being kind of a measure of goodness of fit. So it says all else being equal, you should prefer grammars which can explain the kinds of data that kids observe from their parents. And if you follow Bayes' rule, the kind of right thing to do with these two components is to multiply them together. And if you multiply them together, you come up with a way of scoring any potential grammar, which combines both of them, right? You want something which is a good trade-off between simplicity and fit to the data. So that's what Perfors et al. Did. They came up with 7 or so different grammars of different kinds, and then compared them on child-directed speech in Childus. And when they did that, this is what they got. So each column here is a different grammar. There's a flat grammar which just memorizes things, a couple of regular grammars. These are ones, right, that have a finite memory, finite state machines, essentially. And then there's some grammars here which are context-free grammars, which have real context-free grammar production rules that people are probably familiar with. That's each column. Each level here is different amounts of data. So how much data from Childus you provide to this learning model. And then the scores here are log probability scores for the prior and the likelihood. So if they're log probabilities and we want things which are high probability, then we want log values which are closest to positive infinity. So we can look along a row here, and the things which are closest to positive infinity, which here is also closest to 0, are things which are the highest probability. And the highest probability combination of prior and likelihood is given here in the posterior. So in log space, the posterior is just the sum of the prior and the likelihood. That's the same as multiplying them together. And what you can see basically is that with very little amounts of data, you might like things like just memorizing all of the strings that you see. But as you give this kind of learning model more and more data, it eventually decides that context-free languages are the right ones. Context-free languages have the best posterior, meaning the best trade-off between prior and likelihood. And what that means is that kids can take the kind of data that they see and infer that language is context-free, right? They don't have to innately know that language is context-free. In fact, what Perfors et al. Found is that I think it's 8 or 10 minutes or so of child-directed speech is enough data to convince this kind of unbiased learner that the strings they're seeing are coming from some kind of context-free language. And so that says, look, you don't have to build in the fact that language has a hierarchical structure. That's one of the very first things this kind of learner should be able to acquire just by watching what strings their parents produce. So this is all analysis of Childus, but people have also thought through kind of theoretical analyses, which are a little bit more analogous to Gold's result. In particular, there's a paper by Chater and Vitani in 2007, which shows that that just based on positive evidence, not only can you pick out that language would be context-free, but you can actually identify what computational process, meaning what Turing machine or what program has generated the strings that you're seeing from just observing instances of parents saying or using those strings. So this paper in some sense is the anti-Gold paper, right? Because it establishes that once you move past kind of worst case analyses and start thinking about probability distributions, not only can you identify all of the regular languages or all of the context-free languages, you can also identify any kind of computational process which is generating the data that you see. There's a neat follow-up by Su, Chater, and Vitani in 2011, which took some of these kinds of measures of essentially description length and complexity and tried to predict the relative ungrammaticality of different kinds of ratings, which is very neat. So I'll recommend that also. So this idea generally of doing inferences over computations is a very old one, and it's one that actually is popular in certain corners of artificial intelligence, where the kind of general idea is to say, you know, if you were going to build the most intelligent robot you could, what should that robot do? And one kind of answer that has been worked out formally in these AI theories dating back to the 1960s is that what the robot should do is statistical inference over programs. That robot should look at data in the world and try to figure out what kind of program would have generated that data, and then use that to make new predictions about how stuff in the world is going to happen in the future. And if that sounds sort of esoteric, you should you should think about it instead of programs as scientific theories, right? So if you think of what humans or scientists are doing, we look at data in the world and we try to come up with some kind of account of where that data is coming from. And sometimes that account looks like an equation, but sometimes it might also look like a little computer program, right? Or a complicated computer program that says how all the different pieces of some complicated machine fit together. That kind of picture of looking at data and inferring the computational process that led to it is much, much more general than just kind of language acquisition. In fact, it's a good kind of thing that any intelligent agent that's trying to understand and predict or use the world should be engaged in. So this is a point, I think, that's often left out of these kinds of language learning debates, which is that human computation, like our abilities are really, really broad. Just to give some very quick ideas about this, we know lots of structures outside of language, right? We might know kinship systems, you know your family tree, you know labelings over your family tree, you can reason through who's related to who and how. You can think about structures like that. This is true in music too, right? So people know all kinds of structures and patterns in music, or mathematics. When you learn mathematics, you might learn some kind of new system for representing complicated ideas, complicated abstract mathematical ideas, which violate, you know, any assumption of universal grammar you want to include, right? People are able to learn to manipulate and deal with those kinds of systems. We can learn programming languages, even programming languages of very different types. So here's 3 very different programming languages which have sort of human psychology interfacing with computer processors in different ways. Arbitrary games we can reason through. So here's chess. Here's an 11 by 11 Rubik's Cube. If you ever watch a sort of Rubik's Cube championship, you can see people reasoning through those. My favorite example here, this is the Car Talk guys. This was a radio show in the US where people could call in and, you know, describe some problem with their car, and these guys on the air would kind of reason through what was likely to be wrong with the car and kind of know which follow-up questions to ask in order to diagnose what the problem was. So they have some very complicated kind of causal model about how all the pieces of a car interrelate, in the same way that a mathematician might have a very complicated model of how pieces of some mathematical theory relate, or how ordinary people might have some kind of theory about how kinship terms relate. The point of all of these, right, is that the ability to kind of manipulate structure and to deal with rich, fancy, complicated kinds of structures is not unique to human language, right? It's found all over the place in human cognition. And that's part of why people have been interested in these kind of very general structure and algorithm learning models outside of language acquisition research. Okay, so if I go back to these kinds of questions about how kids learn language, there's one kind of alternative here, which is that people have a very general ability to learn and manipulate rich spaces of algorithms, right, across all of these different domains. And then there's a question of what happens if we apply those kinds of models, these kind of general algorithm learning models, to language. And maybe the first problem, right, in applying those kinds of models to language is that language itself is really, really complicated, right? There's, you know, natural language structures are very difficult to build kind of engineering systems for, or scientific theories for. And so instead of working with actual language to start here, how we got started in this project is applying these kinds of methods and techniques to formal languages. So people may be familiar with formal languages from either linguistics or computer science. Basically, a formal language is just a set of strings. And the formal languages that people have thought most about are sets of strings where the strings can be produced according to some kind of simple rule. So for instance, the formal language AB, 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 and so on, right, is some sequence of A followed by B. And I can generate that entire infinite set of strings just from some kind of formal rule, some kind of formal pattern. These kinds of, formal languages as a kind of tool for investigating natural language dates back to this old paper by Chomsky, Three Models for the Description of Language, which is where we got our title from. And Chomsky basically describes different patterns in natural language and the kind of corresponding formal systems that are kind of approximate models of those languages. And then points out the fact that depending on the properties of the formal language, different kinds of computational structures might be needed to process them. So in particular, there's some kind of substructures of language which you can handle with just a finite list, right? I can just remember some list of acceptable strings. There's others that don't have a finite list, but can be processed with a finite amount of memory. So my AB example is one like that, where I don't need to remember very much. I just need to remember like the previous character that I said in order to correctly generate strings from that language. And there's others which require, well, there's a variety of others which require an unbounded amount of memory. And so this paper by Chomsky really pointed out that different aspects of different aspects of language require different kinds of computational processes that vary along these dimensions, like whether they're finite or infinite, and whether they require an infinite amount of memory or not. In particular, these kind of aspects of natural language live in different places along the Chomsky-Schutzenberger hierarchy, right? So this is the hierarchy of different levels of kind of computational complexity. For a kind of recent review of this, I'll just refer people to this paper, but I'll just talk through a couple of very quick examples. So for example, we could think of a formal language like a to the n. That's any number of a's in a row. And we can think about a construct in English that follows that. And you might think about something like adjectives, right? So I could say the angry young moose, or I could put in more adjectives. I could put in 12 adjectives there if I wanted to. So the pattern of adjectives there is effectively like the formal language a to the n. Here's just a little cartoon version for AB to the n. That's any number of A's followed by B's. And I could think about a construct in language like determiner noun pairs or something like this. Chomsky gave this example for A to the n, B to the n. That's an example of a language where, you know, if I have 3 A's at the beginning, I then have to have exactly 3 B's after that. And he gave this example of if-then constructions, where each of the ifs are like the A's, and each of the thens are like the B's. And so I could say a sentence like, if Mary cried, then John was sad, then John is empathetic. And this kind of matching, of course, is just approximate because there's other stuff in natural language that goes in between the A's and the B's. But the point here is that sort of abstractly, right, if I map A's to ifs and B's to thens, I have this kind of general structure. And this is actually an interestingly different structure than the two above it, because this one requires potentially an unbounded amount of information to be remembered, right? If I kept embedding and nesting ifs, I'd have to keep track of how many I had, and that number could potentially get large. Whereas this one, even though it looks really similar, right, requires only a finite amount of memory because I just have to remember what the previous character I said was. And there's other kinds of formal languages people have considered. So here's language you could call WW, so that's any string followed by that same string repeated. That's another one that not only takes an unbounded amount of memory, but it can't be generated from a simple context-free grammar. Here's just a construction that's meant to illustrate this, where if I get some series of nouns of subjects in order, then I get the corresponding verbs in order too. So if I thought about these colors, if I thought of this as green, red, blue, I would have green, red, blue again afterwards. And there's even other kinds of more complicated types of patterns. This is one that people have used to model different kinds of nested dependencies in language. So any number of A's followed by any number of B's, but then the same number of C's as you got A's and the same number of D's as you got B's. And so on. So these are just meant to kind of remind people about the types of structures that occur in natural language And these will actually be the inputs to the learning model that I'll talk about. So we'll be giving the learning model things like strings from A to the end, B to the end, or strings from this language, and looking to see whether it can learn them. And if it can learn them, then great, because then it has the potential to learn these kinds of more complicated versions of those learning problems that occur in natural language. I should say that the sort of linking of these formal languages to natural languages has been kind of messy and informal. So there haven't been great kind of formalized arguments linking these formal languages to actual natural languages. But nonetheless, I think that there's still something kind of right about people needing to represent and acquire these kinds of structures somehow. Okay, so let me talk some about program induction as a kind of model of learning. The kind of working hypothesis that we'll be using here is one that's just directly motivated by Chader and Vitani, which is that learning operates over some Turing-complete space of computation. So what that means is that, we're sort of motivated by this fact that learners outside of language can learn all kinds of other things. And so we'd like to be working with some system which has the potential to learn lots of other kinds of interesting things. In this kind of view, learning is like programming. So learners combine existing operations. Learners bring to the problem some kind of set of mental operations, and they compose or combine those operations in order to form some kind of theory that explains the data that they see. And in this case, the kind of generative theory that they're going to make is a grammar. They're going to be building some kind of computer program which might mimic a context-free grammar or a regular grammar or some other kind of object. But at the end of the day, what it's going to do is generate strings. These programs you can think of as being written in a language of thought. So there's been a lot of kind of work and argument in philosophy of mind trying to argue that mental representations have this kind of property of essentially being like computer programs. They're built up out of pieces, and humans are able to put together those pieces in new ways in order to explain data. And the meaning of kind of the whole thing that you build, the whole representation you make, is built up out of the representations of the individual pieces that go into it. And when you have a learning model like this, much like in the Perfors model, more input drives revision, improvement of programs, or can justify additional complexity. So there'll be a built-in bias to have programs or representations which are simple. And as the learner accumulates more and more data, that can justify kind of more and more complicated theories, in the same way that if you just had one data point, you might come up with a very simple kind of scientific theory. But if you had 10,000 data points, you might be happy coming up with one that has, more parameters or more moving pieces or something like that. Okay, so the first part of this learning is like programming. Well, we have to specify what the programming language is like. And for that, we just picked this kind of very simple set of operations. Actually, it's motivated by Structure and Interpretation of Computer Programs, which is a book that kind of builds up computer programming from about as minimal pieces as you can. And so the kind of basic operations that we're going to assume are available to learners are simple kinds of manipulations on lists. So taking two elements and putting them together in a list, taking the first element of a list or everything except the first element of a list, or maybe inserting some part of a list into another list. There's basic kinds of logical operations, so checking equality or checking if a list is empty, and or a not, computing a conditional. And then maybe most importantly, there's this flip operation, which is a stochastic primitive. So flip here, if you execute a program that has flip in it, it will give you heads some percent of the time and tails, or true some percent of the time and false some other percent of the time. And that means that when we build a program like this, there's not just one way to execute it. There's often infinitely many ways to execute it, depending on what direction flip comes out in. And so that means that capacity essentially is the thing that allows programs here to generate distributions on strings, right? So if you wanted to build up some distribution on strings, you could include flip in your program. And if you do that maybe recursively, meaning if you have a recursive function call, then you can build up kind of infinite distributions or distributions on infinitely many strings, I should say. There's some operations here on sets of strings, so or sets of symbols. So there's some alphabet of characters that has to be given to the learning model. And then you can do things with that alphabet of characters like compute unions or intersections or sample. Sample is another stochastic primitive. There's built-in elements of the alphabet. So in these formal languages I've been talking about, there are things like A, B, C, and D. They might be arguments to a function or even just an empty symbol. And then finally, there's function calls. So can think of what I'm defining here as some function f1, and f1 might be defined in terms of some other functions, or it might be defined recursively in terms of itself. Just like in programming, how you have to either have recursion or loops in order to get kind of interesting kinds of behavior out. Here you need some kind of ability for a function to call itself. And we include a couple different varieties of those, which mostly have to do with how they interact with the flip operation. So if I'm in a function and I call f1, I could fix all of the values of flip and ask for that same value back, or I could get the stochastic version, which recalls all of the flips and makes them flip again. Both of those end up being important. So the hypothesis space for the learner is essentially all of the ways that you can put together these operations into a valid program, right? All of the programs you can write with these kinds of things. It turns out you can write pretty much anything you want with these kinds of operations, even though they look very simple. So the idea here, right, is to build in some simple kind of basis like this, and then see what happens for learning. Let's get this slide. So here's kind of a setup of how things go. So this is a kind of cartoon setup where here's a parent and here's a kid. The parent has in their head some generating system which is written using these operations. So this is their kind of fixed mental representation. This one I think happens to be one that generates a to the n, b to the n. It's built up out of those pieces, right? So I've just composed those functions in the right way. And it not only generates a to the n, b to the n, but it generates it with a particular probability distribution. In this case, one where the short strings are higher probability and the long strings are less high probability. Here's the learner. Of course, the learner doesn't get to see what's in the parent's head, so they don't see this stuff. But what they do observe is are strings which are generated according to this, right? So we say, okay, let's run the generating program from the parent, pretend the parent had uttered those strings, and now the learner's job is to take these uttered strings and figure out how to build a theory of it in their own mind, right? To come up with some composition of their own operations, which can explain why it is or how it is that they're observing this particular set of strings as opposed to any other one. And so from this point of view, right, this is very much unlike gold learning, right? It's unlike gold learning because the data that's provided to kids, to learners, is sampled from some distribution here. It's not from parents trying to mislead them. And the learners here are pretty smart, right? So they have access to some collection of primitives, and their job is to figure out some way of putting together those kind of computational primitive pieces in order to explain the data that they saw. Learners here are much more like scientists, right? They're scientists who take data and then try to build some theory of it. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about applying this model to different kinds of formal languages. I'm going to be showing a bunch of plots that look like these. Let me just explain what these are. So on the x-axis is an amount of data that you provide to the learning model. And that's on a log scale. So it starts off at 1 and 10, and it goes up to 1,000 or 10,000 or more for some of the other languages. What's plotted on the y-axis are 3 different measures of the model's kind of predictions, right? So we give the model, like in this case, we might give the model 10 strings and then run the model inference, which is essentially it's searching over compositions of those operations, and then look at the model's predictions about what kinds of strings it thinks are likely versus unlikely. And what we do is we measure those compared to the target grammar. So we have both a precision and a recall measure here, essentially quantifying how much of the strings the learner produces are in the parent grammar and how much of the strings in the parent grammar are in the learner's grammar. And all of this has to just be approximated. So it all has to be approximated because, if I give you an arbitrary program that's written like this, with stochastic operations like that, it's very hard to kind of analytically compute what a precision or a recall would be, but it's not so hard to just kind of run it a bunch of times or enumerate a bunch of the ways that flip could have come out, and write down the kind of highest probability strings that thing produces. And finally, there's an F-score, right? So an F-score is just a harmonic mean of precision and recall. So if we look at these examples, here's an A to the N language. Here's sigma plus, which is any sigma is the alphabet, right? So it's any of the allowed characters, and plus means one or more. And here's an AB to the N language. All of these can be learned really quickly, less than 10 strings or so. I should say too that the x-axis here is not unique strings, so it's not 10 different strings, it's 10 samples from the target language. So if I sample from A to the N 10 times, most of those times I'm going to get A, and a couple of those times I'll get AA, and a couple of those times I might get AAA, and so on. So the x-axis here is not number of unique strings, but you can see that within 10 or so samples, I'm able to learn all of these different kinds of patterns. Like gold, this is all just from positive evidence, right? So all you're seeing is things which are sampled from the grammar. Here's another kind of interesting comparison. So here's A to the N, B to the N, right? This is NAs followed by NBs. And you can learn that in 10 or 20 or so sampled strings. And actually, you can learn these other things which are, in some sense, more complicated from similar amounts of data. So things like A to the N, B to the N, C to the N. This is informal language theory is known not to be able to be written down with a context-free grammar. So this guy is not regular, this guy, but he is context-free. This guy is context-free and not regular. And you can go on getting kind of more and more complicated types of examples, which this thing is usually able to learn pretty effectively. So what this shows, right, is that positive evidence is good for identifying these languages. Let me just show you the full kind of, oh wait, sorry. It's not only is it useful to look at the kind of precision and recall scores here, but we can also look at the actual representations that these things learn. I won't go through the kind of details, but here's, for instance, what it learns for A to the N, right? And it learns that I can pair together an A with depending on the outcome of a flip, either nothing or a recursive call back to F0, calling this thing again. And so that's a little recursive program that will generate A to the N and is discovered by this learning model within about 10 strings. Here's one for A to the N, B to the N. It's a similar kind of recursive little structure like that. Here's a kind of bigger collection of strings like this. They also vary in complexity. The kind of main point here, right, is that most of these can be learned pretty effectively within 100 or so different strings, different string observations. Let me just highlight a couple of these examples. One kind of nice comparison is to look at A to the N versus languages I'm calling A to the 1, 2, 3 or A to the 1, 2, 3, 4. So A to the 1, 2, 3 is A, AA, and AAA. So it's only 1, 2, or 3 A's in a row. And the thing that's interesting here is that these ones which are finite are actually much harder to learn than the infinite one. And the reason is that if you were to write down the programs, the infinite one has a very short program. It's the one I just showed you, whereas these ones have longer, more complicated programs. And because this model has this kind of simplicity bias, it naturally will kind of tend towards these infinite generalizations as opposed to these kind of finite generalizations. Those take more data. Here's just a few examples of languages which are unions. So they include a couple of different kinds of structures which this thing can acquire. Here's some of these nested kinds of dependencies that I was describing before. Here's a language which is the set of kind of valid parentheses, right, where you don't have more closes than you have opens. You can think of that as the set of valid syntactic parses for a sentence. That's a pretty easy thing to acquire. Here are some which might feel unnatural and that the model can mostly get. Actually, I think these dips from 100% are mostly due to this kind of approximation bounds on kind of string length and these kind of things. It's important to point out, though, that even though this model is kind of able to do anything, right? It's in principle able to learn any kind of structure we're interested in. That doesn't mean it's practically able to learn anything. So here are a couple of languages. The Bach languages are ones, strings where, you know, I have the same number of A's and B's, or the same number of A's, B's, and C's, or X to the length of X. So, you know, if X is 5 symbols long, that X needs to be repeated 5 different times. All of those are things which the learning model doesn't do a great job of. And it doesn't do a great job because they're either hard to write down in the programming language, or they have kind of close alternatives which are almost right but not quite. Okay, so those are simple kinds of formal languages. I wanted to talk about artificial language learning because there's a lot of work trying to essentially give usually adults, sometimes kids, new kinds of formal languages to learn, and then trying to sort of model their learning processes as they observe data. And so what we did is we basically went through the literature here in artificial language learning and pulled out a bunch of these kinds of systems which people have tried to teach participants in these experiments. Let me just start by highlighting, here's one from Safran. So people may be familiar with the Safran, Aslan, and Newport studies, which give people basically a long concatenation of syllables. And if you listen to this concatenation of syllables or words for long enough, at first it doesn't look like anything, but after just a few minutes of listening to it, people naturally chunk it and realize that there are, this thing is actually made up of repetitions of different words here. So we can do the same thing for the learning model, and you know, within about 100 or so strings, it's able to come up with a kind of system which recognizes that words are part of this kind of generating process. So that's what that says, right, is that word segmentation and all of those kind of word segmentation studies can easily fall under this umbrella, right? Because what you're trying to do in the learning model is figure out a concise explanation for the data you see, and that's exactly what you need in order to do these word segmentation problems. Here are some ABA and ABB languages. These are versions of languages used by Gary Marcus and colleagues to study kind of variable learning. So in these experiments and in these learning models, you would give kids patterns that follow one of these. So like in the ABB pattern, you might tell them do, re, re, and ti, fa, fa. And they eventually pick up on the fact that there's a repetition of a syllable there. Learning model can do those really quickly, really easily. Here's a Reber language. So this is an old finite state machine learning experiment that this thing can learn. Here's some experiments by Morgan and Newport, where they were giving people essentially little context-free grammars to acquire. It can acquire those. Here's a complicated example that it doesn't do a great job on. This is a finite state machine from Berwick and Pareto that's basically meant to capture English auxiliaries, and it's a complicated set of dependencies. It has a very complicated program that would generate it. And at least our kind of current inference methods don't do a great job with it because you know, our inference methods are actually kind of simplistic. They're basically versions of random search. So you randomly compose together different operations, and that has a hard time finding something so complicated like this. Okay, let me talk very briefly about a simplified English context-free grammar. You know, in most of these languages and in all of the formal languages, they're all kind of very simple, isolated kinds of grammars. So we were interested in looking at something that's a little bit more complicated, a little bit richer. So we came up with this kind of simple version of what you could think of as like a linguistics 101 context-free grammar. Okay, where a sentence is a noun phrase and a verb phrase, and I have different kinds of verb phrases. So I have transitive and intransitive. I have complementizers like that, where I can embed a sentence. I have potentially recursion on my adjectives, like the example I started with, prepositional phrases, recursion there. And so from this grammar, right, I can construct strings like this, right? So I get determiner, adjective, noun, preposition, determiner, adjective, noun, verb, complementizer, noun, verb. And so this is a complicated kind of sentence, right? It might be something like the delightful accordionist by the old cafe knew that music heals. Okay, so of course the learning model doesn't know anything about this. It's never given this this context-free structure. It's not even told it's context-free. All it gets are strings that look like these. Particularly, we give it strings that are generated from that look like these things. They have a probability distribution. And it's the exact same learning model that we use for the artificial languages or for the formal languages that we started with. Here's what its learning looks like. So within about 100 or 200 sampled strings from this, we're basically at ceiling. I think there's one string that it didn't learn it could acquire. So it acquired some approximation to this context-free grammar, but it's an approximation that's almost always right, that almost always learns the right thing, the right set of strings, I should say. One other thing we can do though is we can look at what happens to this kind of learner as it accumulates more and more data. And so what I'm plotting here is on the x-axis, the amount of data that we've given to this learning model. Each color here corresponds to a different string, a different sentence. And then the height assigned to that color is the probability that the model assigns to that sentence. So for instance, this teal color here, it eventually learns is a pretty high probability sentence, maybe something like noun, verb, noun, or something like that. But when it starts off producing it way back here, it actually thinks it's pretty low probability. And so you can see as you provide data to this learning model, it's not only revising the strings that it thinks are possible, like this string initially, it learns is either very low probability or impossible. Same for this one. It eventually hones in on the correct kind of set of strings, but then goes through and also reshapes their probabilities so that it's acquiring something which is close to the adult grammar in terms of the probability distribution that it assigns to strings. This is one other figure of kind of visualizing what happens throughout the course of learning here. What this shows on the x-axis, each column here is a different sentence, right? So it's some different sequence of symbols. On the y-axis, each row corresponds to one hypothesis, and the coloring corresponds to what probability that hypothesis assigns to each of these strings. These strings are importantly chosen to be ones which don't occur in the data. So you can think of this as kind of pure generalization. What kinds of generalizations does this model make from a finite amount of data? So for instance, if we look at like the very first row up here, that row is mostly 0 across all of these strings. It's all white. And that means that the top ranked hypothesis, that's up towards the top there, thinks that none of these strings are high probability. Probably they're all actually 0 probability for the model, except for this one. That one has a little bit of probability and so on. If we go down a little bit, we find some hypotheses which start assigning probability to these strings, even though they've never been observed, right? And if we go down more and kind of look generally across this, what you can see is that there's really complicated patterns of generalization, right? So it's not the case that this kind of model would say stuff it hasn't seen is impossible or stuff it hasn't seen is low probability. In fact, its beliefs about stuff it hasn't seen depend very much on the details of the hypothesis, right? Depend on the details of which row you're on here. So I often hear this argument that says something like, well, you know, language learners show systematic patterns of generalization about stuff they haven't seen before. Therefore, that's evidence of UG, right? And that's just not true, right? Because this model shows systematic patterns of generalization about stuff it hasn't seen before, right? Which you can see as the kind of non-random or pseudo-random nature of this kind of visualization. But it has no UG, right? It has no built-in expectations about the form of grammar. Where these generalizations come from, is essentially the hypothesis space. So it essentially learns that there's strings which are which might be low probability and not observed in the data, but nonetheless have some probability because the sort of shortest or most concise generating program assigns them some kind of probability. So all of those are the kinds of things you should expect from a kind of computationally sophisticated learner. Complicated generalizations about stuff you haven't seen before. Okay, so I've talked about each of these kinds of learning results. Let me just wrap up by going through a couple of quick discussion points and a conclusion here. So just to sort of summarize what I think all of this modeling result shows, the first is that this kind of idealized learner can construct computational devices to generate key structures in natural language, right? It's not told to look for regular languages or context-free languages or something. It's just handed a collection of programming primitives. And when it looks at data, it has to put together those programming primitives in order to form something which can explain the data that it sees. And if you look at those, sometimes those might look like they have some of the characteristics of a context-free grammar or something, but that's entirely built by the learner, right? That's not constrained in any way or guided in any way by the learning process. It's just an explanation of the data that the learner is given. What this means is that essentially, I think these learnability arguments, especially gold and kind of variants of it, are really wrong, right? Children don't need language-specific representations or biases to solve learnability problems any more than this learning model needs language-specific biases and representations in order to solve its learnability problems, right? It works well just as a kind of statistical inference problem, just as a way of solving that kind of statistical inference problem. That doesn't mean that there aren't language-specific biases or representations, but the learnability is not a good reason for thinking they're there. You know, you might think of other evidence that should convince people that those are real, but it probably doesn't have anything really to do with kind of basic challenges faced by learning. These kinds of complex structured generalizations, infinite productivity, and fast learning of latent generative processes, these are all things people have pointed to in child language acquisition and tried to say, look, these things are evidence of UG, right? Kids can take some small amount of data and they come up with this generative system that produces stuff it's never seen before. They can learn this kind of syntactic system generating strings, even though all they see are the strings. They never get to observe the parent syntactic system. And when they do that, they have these complex patterns of generalization. None of those are good evidence for UG, right? Because all of those are things that we find in this learning system, which has no built-in expectations about the form of language at all. In fact, I think all of those are much better evidence for thinking about learning systems which work over spaces of computations, right? Which have kind of rich internal representations and rich kind of computational abilities, not necessarily any kind of evidence about stuff being built in for language. Let me just bring up two kinds of discussion points so that I think are kind of central to what the kind of main takeaways, I guess, from this work. One kind of discussion point is how domain specific are these computations that underlie language learning? And I've been talking about the model as a domain general model, right? It's one that doesn't have language specific knowledge built in. And what I haven't really emphasized yet, actually, is that this model is a kind of relative of one very much like, of others very much like it, that crop up all over the place in cognitive science and are used across all kinds of different domains. So in my own work, we've used these to model number and counting acquisition. That's a little procedure that kids learn. Generalized quantifier learning, right? Those you can also think of as little procedures that kids learn, or Boolean logic and logical connectives, that kind of learning you can model with this system. Maria Malrich has data on learning simple geometrical patterns like these, which she models with this kind of compositional program-like system. Tomer Ullman has work on magnetism learning. So if you learn about some kind of new domain like magnets, where there's positives and negatives, and there's laws about how the positives and the negatives interact with each other, or how the positives and the positives interact with each other, you can write down that kind of sort of domain knowledge, that kind of theory about magnetism, with a really similar kind of model. It's a similar kind of program model where you're composing primitives in essentially the same way. And this crops up all over the place. So question asking, or kind of semantic theories. So here's a model of kind of semantic knowledge and how that's organized, using this same kind of logical representation system, or work even on things like handwritten digit recognition. So work by Brendan Lake and colleagues on single shot learning, essentially from handwritten digits. You can model using the same kind of programming language setup. So when I say it's domain general, what I really mean is that the same basic assumptions of thinking of learners as doing inference over a space of computations gets used in all of these different domains and a bunch of others to quantitatively model the patterns and generalizations that people make in these other areas, and it does a very good job generally in them. I'll just point to this paper I have. This is work led by Josh Rule, who's a grad student at MIT, which is basically a big overview or review of this kind of learning. The paper is called "The Child as Hacker," where hacker doesn't mean somebody who's maliciously breaking into your computer, but it means like somebody hacking on code and trying to think through code and improve it. And we talk about a couple of different domains outside of language, actually, where people have used that metaphor really productively in order to try to understand what's going on in child language learning. And in particular, what we argue is that there's lots of things that kids do and that can be motivated by thinking about what computer scientists do in terms of how they organize code or reorganize it, how they refactor it, or the kinds of considerations that are important for building complicated computational systems that probably would provide a good guide for cognitive development and sort of acquisition very generally in cognitive science. Because that is the problem that kids face. They're faced with multiple domains across all of these different areas, and trying to come up with computationally rich theories in each of them. And that in itself, just kind of organizing that is a difficult type of problem. So this question of sort of how domain specific these computations are, how domain specific they are for real language learning, I'd say nobody knows. Domain-specific knowledge is not evidence of domain-specific learning mechanisms in the same way that it's not in any of those domains I just talked about, right? The whole point of a domain general learning mechanism is that it creates domain-specific knowledge. And examples I've talked about, I've tried to show how domain general learning mechanisms can create knowledge that looks like grammars or looks like some of the kind of structural properties that you find in human language. And in particular, nobody knows what powerful domain general learning systems might look like when they're applied to language, right? As these kind of systems and learning processes improve, we don't know what they're going to do, and we don't know where they might succeed and fail. The second discussion point here is one that I've heard often about these types of models. So about, for instance, the Perfors et al. Model or the Chater and Vitani theorem. Which is that isn't it sort of easier? Aren't you making this learning problem more difficult than you could, right? Isn't it easier to build in one grammar like UG rather than some big space of possibilities, right? Why should we think that there are 7 or 10 or infinitely many kind of possibilities that learners are considering when the alternative theory just says there's one, right? Isn't it easier? Isn't it sort of less genetic load or something and to think that there's just one thing that's innate? And I think there's two kinds of answers to this. One is to point to these other kinds of domains and say, look, we already know that kids are able to acquire computationally sophisticated representations in all of those other areas. So given that we know that computational representation and inference system has to be there for counting and math and kinship and magnetism and all these other areas, it doesn't cost anything extra to suppose that this might be at play in grammar learning. That's one kind of answer. The other kind of answer is I think to point out that it's actually not quite the right logic to say that that just building in one thing is easier than building in everything. And my favorite kind of illustration of this is actually this short story, The Library of Babel. And the Library of Babel is basically a story of a person who's born into an infinite library, and this infinite library contains every possible book. So it contains every possible sequence of characters that you could ever write down in a book. You might think that's great. Okay, that means that all of the books that are ever written are there. That's true. Or that ever could be written are there. That's also true. But it's also true that kind of nonsensical things are there, right? So you might wander around this library for a year and find, the first couple words of Moby Dick, and then just nonsense random characters after that, right? Because all of that stuff has to be there. All possible books have to be there. And so you're never sure if you're reading the exact right book, and it should be hard to find anything which actually has meaning and content. So the short story is actually pretty interesting. It's a person it's kind of dismal. It's a person wandering around this library trying to find meaning. But the point of it, kind of what's interesting about this story from the point of view of learning models, is that this library actually contains no information, or essentially no information. And you can see that because the entire contents of this library can be compressed down to a really short sentence, right? I can communicate to you the entire contents of the library by saying it contains all possible books. Okay, now you know everything that's in the library, and it was given a really short description. So that says that there's not much information there, and in fact, there's less information in the whole library than there is in one of its single books. Right, Moby Dick contains way more information than the entire Library of Babel contains. So the lesson here is that a larger hypothesis space often takes less innate information to specify. And for us, that happens because we say, look, here's some primitives. Now the hypothesis space is just all the ways to combine them, right? That hypothesis space is very easy to describe. Whereas one particular long program is actually much harder to describe, just like one particular book in the Library of Babel is harder to describe than the whole thing. So, okay. So I started off with these kinds of questions about how children learn language, how domain specific it is, what the kind of size of the hypothesis space might be, what the inferential abilities of learners might be. And I've essentially tried to argue that the UG answer isn't really justified in any of these cases, right? We don't really know about domain specificity. And certainly the existence of domain specific representations isn't evidence either way about that, because the learning model I talked about, right, learns domain-specific representations. It learns A to the N, B to the N, but it doesn't come with any kind of biases one way or the other, and it doesn't, and it potentially could learn other kinds of structures. The size of the hypothesis space, right? Well, actually, I think it's easier to build in the bigger hypothesis space here than to build in one particular grammar. And so if we're trying to come up with the kind of most genetically plausible or parsimonious thing, it probably makes sense to build in a large hypothesis space. And the inferential abilities of learners, right? I've sort of tried to argue that if you look just slightly outside of language at any other area of cognition, what you find is that learners have an ability to deal with really rich structures and to reason stochastically, reason probabilistically in their learning. And that allows them to construct theories and representations and structures in other domains. And so that already tells us that learners are pretty smart in terms of how they learn data and what kinds of hypotheses they're able to think about. And so a good kind of plausible guess for that, right, is that those kinds of abilities might be at play in language acquisition. So the alternative here, right, people have a general ability to learn and manipulate rich spaces of algorithms. And this work I see as kind of a tiny step in trying to apply these kinds of models to language, right? Trying to say what happens if we take that general algorithm learning ability and apply it to language. And in these examples, what these examples show basically is that when you do that, you end up with something which can learn unseen generative structures. It can learn the correct languages. It shows complicated patterns of generalization, and it doesn't need to be constrained in any way like gold or other kinds of approaches might make you think it needed to be. Okay, so let me just thank you for inviting me here, and thank my co-author Leon Yang, who worked on a bunch of these formal languages and many aspects of kind of implementing this model to start. I'll just add too that all of the code for this is available. Actually, this project in particular has motivated the lab to create this library called Fleet, which does the statistical inference part of this. So in Fleet, you tell it what the primitives are, what the data is, and it goes and figures out how to compose the primitives in order to explain the data. In Fleet, you can find other models, some of the logic learning models and number learning models, as well as these formal language ones, are all implemented in the same system. Okay, thanks.
All right, so thanks for the very interesting talk. I have separated some questions here, and I think they kind of go in order given your slide. Sure. So hopefully they make sense given the order of the topic. So the first question is, are you assuming that the sentence is the basis for grammar rather than conversation, discourse? And the follow-up question is, isn't this an idea based largely on 19th century work on propositions?
On prepositions?
Propositions.
Propositions. Oh,
yeah.
Yeah. So the learning setup is really simplified in this model, right? It's one where all you observe are strings, and your job is to come up with a generative model of those strings. This is part of why I think actually focusing on formal languages is useful, is because they're kind of a simplified setting where you face many of the general learnability problems, right? The evidence underdetermines you. There's complex structures that you can't observe, that you have to kind of infer the presence of just based on the stuff you do observe. Those kinds of learning problems are faced even in this kind of toy domain. And so I think that question is right, that like language is actually much more complicated. It's not just syntax. It's not just a set of strings. There's semantics, there's pragmatics, there's, how you use discourse, how you use all of these other kinds of factors. I wouldn't, I'm certainly not claiming to have something which can explain any of those additional factors. The idea here is very much like, it's kind of like if you think of like an anatomical model, right? Where, if you go to medical school, you might dissect a cadaver, but they also might show you an anatomical model, which kind of abstracts away from all of the blood and guts of a cadaver, right? And pulls out the stuff which is really important and shows you the pieces and how those pieces might relate in a simplified setting. And that's really the goal of, I think, computational modeling generally, but certainly this work is to pull out some of the key kinds of learning challenges and show how they're actually solved by these kinds of approaches. And then the full kind of complicated thing is really complicated and hard, but also really interesting.
Mm-hmm. In a way, it's kind of analogous to what traditional formal linguistics would assume for ideal learner and so on, to kind of abstract away from the noise and all the variation that you observe. And there was also another question on that, was like, what's the role of meaning? So I guess you've already touched on that. The second question I have here is related to this prior of Occam's razor. Do you think it's innate, or is it simply a function of the underdeveloped traits of children acquiring language at first?
Yeah. Sorry, can I just make one comment on meaning first?
Sure.
Which is that there's no meaning in this model at all. So it's all just about modeling sets of strings. But meaning itself is something we've thought a lot about. And in fact, learning CCG style kind of compositional semantics is something we've done with these models. That's actually where we started with these models, was trying to learn semantics like that, as well as learning semantics in other domains like number words or quantifiers. So we've actually been really interested in semantics, and we use similar kinds of tools as we use here. But it's very hard to put all the pieces together, which is why these kind of simplified settings, I think, are useful. So your question about Occam's razor, I think that it's very plausibly innate and domain general that that what people want is simple explanations, and we want them as scientists, or we want them in learning some other kinds of stuff, but we also will want them in language acquisition. And it's actually a little bit hard to formulate a probabilistic model that doesn't have a version of Occam's razor in it. Because essentially, like, all of the probabilities have to sum up to one, and so that tells you that if you have infinitely many hypotheses, there's lots of them which will be, most of them will have really low probability. And once that's true, then you're kind of equating probability with simplicity, right? Because that sort of by definition, the things that are high in the prior are things which are simplest for learners to learn, right? They could be learned with the least amount of data. And so I think it's somewhere in between, like, interestingly true biologically and kind of true by default by if we're working with these kinds of probabilistic models.
All right. There's I think this is in a way a follow-up question, because it's asking about the possibility of having a model such as the one you've been working on, this type of computational model, and apply it to a more realistic data sample, real childhood size sample of real human language, etc., and see how well it does, and whether it's actually going to acquire a reasonable grammar given the input from the data. Is this something that you're planning to do in the foreseeable future? Is this?
Yeah. I mean, it's so the one piece of this research program, I guess, which is kind of hidden, is that there's behind the scenes here, there's actually a ton of work that we did to try to make a model which works on these instances. And essentially what's hard about that is nothing about the kind of general learnability. It's essentially about the search, right? It's about how learners can take data and invert the process to say, given this data, what's a likely generating sequence of, what's a likely generating program. And part of the reason that's hard, I think, is that the tools we have for doing that are really dumb. I mean, they're really just versions of stochastic search, and you run into interesting kinds of computability issues and problems if you try to do anything other than that, I think. What I sort of suspect is that there's some smarter algorithms and heuristics that really improve this search on actual childlike language. And we don't quite know what those are, but we in part don't quite know what those are because we don't have great tools yet for kind of exploring this kind of stuff. So that's scaling up to more plausible more plausible languages is certainly what we want to do, but scaling is hard in the technical details to work out. And that problem, I should say, is not just a problem about language, it's also a problem in all of these other domains, right? So like, how do those car mechanics learn the internal causal structure of a car? It's really complicated. There's hundreds or thousands of moving parts that are related to each other in some really complicated way. There's plenty of people that study causal learning, but there's no theory that scales up to their size of causal problems. And that sort of scaling, I think, is an interesting one. But at the same time, like why I'm a little bit optimistic about it, right, is that there are these other kinds of theorems that show like this kind of learning should be possible in principle anyway, right? So we're in this kind of interesting intersection of engineering, essentially machine learning solutions to these things, which we think we can prove that there are probably good solutions to somewhere. So.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I'm sure you get a lot of questions related to the hypothesis space, and you even have that on your slides, and probably because you anticipate questions related to, but isn't it worse to have this kind of seemingly infinite, infinite possibilities and so on? But one thing that people normally talk about when they're considering, what can be generated cross-linguistically is, okay, some patterns are more or less natural, some patterns are more or less frequent. And as you said, I think you mentioned this a couple of times, the model is capable of learning a lot of things that you wouldn't necessarily find out there, right? And so in terms of like typologically speaking, isn't it too permissive?
Yeah, so I think it depends on what you think causes the typological data, right?
Mhm.
So certainly, like in language typology, there's all kinds of other pressures, like languages are used for communication, and the communication might differ a little bit depending on the cultural situation. And it's kind of accumulated and transmitted over multiple generations and all these kind of things, right? So I sort of understand those arguments from typology about language being constrained in certain ways. But I also think that there's plenty of things which are very language-like, which are not constrained and which we're perfectly able to learn, right? Mathematics is a good example. Programming languages are another example, where language typology, as far as I can tell, has nothing to do with the kinds of structures you're able to learn in mathematics or other domains. So it might turn out to be the case that there are interesting typological constraints, but given that typological patterns involve all of these other kinds of pressures as well, I at least don't find that as a convincing case for kind of constraining the set of hypotheses. There's one other point here, though, which is that in the learning model, right, there's some set of primitives which are chosen. And I picked some primitives that I thought were kind of simple from computer science, right? But, the predictions of the learning model are sensitive to what primitives you choose. So if you said, oh, I think there's some other kind of operation which people are also able to do, you could put that into this kind of model and generate predictions, which might be very close or might be different from these kinds of predictions. So if it's the case that that learners have, some other kind of operation that we haven't included, or there's some kinds of things which are high in the prior for these kinds of learning models, those will end up translating into learnability pressures on the kind of full outcome, right? The full hypothesis space, right? Because the set of primitives effectively changes what's simple and what's complicated in terms of expressing different types of languages. What that means is that there's not a kind of simple translation from patterns across languages to constraints on the hypothesis space if you're forming the hypothesis space out of primitives like that. It's a really complicated kind of interaction. So in other domains, in kind of logic, we've done some work trying to reverse engineer the hypothesis space. And you can use this fact that two different hypothesis spaces make different predictions to say which of those predictions best matches people's generalization patterns. And you can do that, kind of reasonably well in, if you're looking at logic, first order logic or propositional logic or something like that. Those are the kinds of concept learning situations where we've thought a lot about this. You could in principle do it here. It's just also computationally hard.
Right. You mentioned some concepts during your talk, like traditional concepts like C command, for example. And I have a question here, which is, how does the model learn these types of concepts? And perhaps like a question before that would be, does it need to in the first place?
Yeah. So in this particular version of the model, it doesn't learn them. And it doesn't need them because none of the formal languages needed that as part of their description. If we gave it a formal language that did have it, then it could learn it. Actually, we have another project in the lab, which I unfortunately don't have slides on, but where we're essentially learning C command and some binding properties using the same kind of thing, right? So if you wanted to give those a syntactic account, right, you can, and you had primitives which allowed you to manipulate the syntactic tree, then it's pretty easy to write down C command. It's, thinking about learners who are acting as little scientists or something, right? Your discovery process for that as a learner could be very much like the discovery process for a syntactician or something, right? Like you would invent it if you were trying to construct a kind of concise account of some data that you saw. Combining that with the grammar learner is hard. We haven't done that, but we've thought specifically about learning some of those kinds of constraints, even though they're not needed in these particular examples, and so they're not learned.
Mm-hmm. And there's a question here about what it would look like to do linguistic analysis based solely on this account, in the sense that we normally use a lot of symbolic representations and theoretical assumptions, et cetera, if you subscribe to a particular school of thought or a theoretical framework. But once you get rid of that and you assume, okay, these are the primitives that we need to generate the patterns we observe in the data, then I guess the question is, what would linguistic analysis look like in that scenario?
Yeah, well, so it's interesting for this learning model that we can take the output of the learning model and look at the representations it gets. And in some of these simple cases, like I showed a to the n or a to the n, b to the n, you can look at it and kind of say like, okay, if I was writing a little program to generate strings, I might write something that looks like that. If you look at the simple English grammar I showed, it's a nightmare. It's really complicated. There's lots of interacting pieces. You could probably spend a year kind of analyzing exactly how the pieces fit together. It's not like, I think that might be a kind of worrying thing for linguistics, right? Because there's lots of well, it's not just that any particular representation like that is complicated and hard to reverse engineer, but there's lots of ones which will be close to each other in terms of their generative capacity, but very different internally structured programs. That's sort of what I was trying to show with that kind of complicated generalization slide. Is that there's, well, the generalizations are complicated, right? And that results from kind of how all of the internal moving pieces interact with each other. So, yeah, I'm not sure exactly how one would do linguistic analysis with this tool, but one might need to do linguistic analysis of the learning output, right, in order to
Right.
kind of what's happening. I guess in principle, actually, you could think about the primitives in a learning model like this as providing a objective measure of complexity, right? So people in linguistic theory will often say like, oh, well, this is a simpler account than that one, right? Or this kind of this kind of analysis is simpler than another one, but there's no quantification of description length, complexity, like an actual quantification of simplicity there. And what these kind of AI theories and program learning theories that I kind of alluded to highlight is that like if you implement things, if you write down the program for theory 1 and theory 2, the length of those programs is actually a pretty good measure of their complexity. So if you can write down a really concise program for a given linguistic theory, then well, it's the kind of thing this learning model would learn, but it's also in a kind of meta scientific point of view a good theory, right? Because it's a concise description.
Yeah, I think it's pretty common for people in linguistics, who are doing linguistic work based on different theories to try and understand the paradigm shift towards more computational models and applications by trying to map certain concepts onto that particular new framework. And it's nice. I think in one of the papers you mentioned that there's this discussion on one of the advantages of using a Bayesian model as opposed to something like neural networks where you don't have so much control over what's going on really, and which is kind of nice. I think it makes the partial mapping a little easier because you can at least see some things and you can kind of. There's one more question here, whether there's any perspective for these statistical computational approaches to be applied to context-sensitive grammars, or if context-free grammars would suffice for the representations you're interested in your research.
Oh yeah, sorry, I did not emphasize that, but I should have. Let me just share this again. So if I go back to this thing, we have context-sensitive grammars here. So well, there's A to the N, B to the N, C to the N down here. Some of these are context, if I'm remembering correctly. And then some of these just like don't even fit into the hierarchy. So things like A to the 2 to the N, I think if I'm remembering correctly, are not even context sensitive. I think XXX here is not one if I'm remembering correctly. So the point here, right, is that it's really more general than that categorization, and it's not constrained just to consider regular versus context free. It's really all computations is what we're interested in. Sure. And actually, this is maybe another quick point I could make, which is that people are very used to thinking about those levels of complexity in the Chomsky hierarchy, right, as maybe mapping onto some psychological notions of complexity. And what this really highlights actually is that some of those things which are higher in terms of, or harder in terms of computational complexity, actually aren't that hard in terms of description length, right? So things like a to the n, b to the n, right, aren't really harder than a to the n, or aren't much. Even these things like XXX, right, is not super hard compared to some of the others. So, you know, there's lots of work, really 50 years of work in cognitive psychology that's all about essentially simplicity biases, right? Finding that people care about the complexity of concepts and representations when they're doing learning. And the thing that's sort of interesting in this kind of learning model is that it highlights complexity just cuts across Chomsky hierarchy levels, right? Chomsky hierarchy things are not, their level on Chomsky hierarchy is not a guide to kind of absolute complexity in the way that you might want it to be. So, you know, my guess is that for human learners, some of these things, like I think XX is probably pretty easy for human learners. Some of these things which are hard in terms of grammatical computation probably will end up being kind of easy for human learners. And complexity is like description length of the shortest generating program is I think a plausible kind of alternative for measuring complexity there.
Right. And I have one more question. This is the final one. Is the bias for the hierarchical structure that you propose simply based on the perspective of the grammar writer? That is the simplest grammar.
Is the bias for hierarchical structure?
For the hierarchical structure that you're proposing, is it based on the perspective of the grammar writer?
I'm not sure. So I'm not sure I'm proposing a hierarchical structure. Like these programs, I guess you could say are hierarchical or something, but I think the right way to think about them is just as programs. And what's important about them as programs is that they vary in length. So there's some of them that are simple, and those are ones that you should learn pretty easily. And there's some of them which are hard, and those are ones which might take you more data. And that measure is, you know, that measure of kind of complexity is determined by the primitives that we build into this system. And those primitives are kind of our guess about what's easy for learners to do, right? So one way you can empirically kind of get traction on that, right, is to say like, okay, these primitives, or any set of primitives anyone hypothesizes, make predictions about the kinds of operations that should be easy for learners. Even outside of language, right? But maybe in things that look like language, and you know, learning kind of discrete patterns or something like that. And so, I guess in that sense, you shouldn't think of them as imposed by us or something. They're just hypotheses. It's just a hypothesis about what operations learners might use to build computations. And ideally, we'd have kind of empirical data on that, or we'd have enough learning data that would let us disentangle different hypotheses about how learning could work there.
Right, and I'm assuming that frequency, the whole frequency aspect is kind of already in the program or in the model, in the sense that it's going to change the likelihood and therefore affect the posterior as you go through learning.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the if you think of a program as generating a distribution on strings, then if I observe some strings of variable frequencies, kind of each token I see is going to have some probability under the grammar. And so stuff that occurs very frequently, I'm going to be led to think that stuff that occurs frequently is kind of high probability under the grammar. So the learners here are not just learning, you know, syntactic structure or something. They're learning a distribution over. They're learning a system which generates a distribution over strings.
Right, which is already giving you like kind of gradient effects for free in a way, which is kind of nice.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. All right, so I don't have any other questions. So thanks a lot for the talk. It was great, and for the discussion after the talk too. And this is all for tonight.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.